Zach, we were talking during the break. For all the cautions we saw, especially in Sunday's race, keeping in mind it was only a 400-mile race and not a 500-mile race, I haven't heard the drivers complaining about Texas like they used to, which is kind of a surprise.
It is, especially considering how much action we saw in Sunday's race. But I think part of that is, listen, we've had this configuration now for the better part of 5 or 6 years. I think the drivers have a better expectation of how to approach the racetrack, how to approach the risk and manage that throughout the course of a race, which is I think why we saw as many cautions late in that race as we did, because at that point, that's when you risk it. That's when the biggest reward is on the table. So go get it. But there's not that same risk to take per se in stage 1 at lap 55 as there is at lap 265. So there was a lot of action. It was interesting. I was entertained throughout the entire race on Sunday. I'm curious to see what the feedback is as we move away from the race weekend, if there's still the opinion that that anything needs to happen at Texas. But to me, that was as good of a Texas race as we've had in a long time, with as great of a crowd as we've had there in a long time too.
And I think there's two elements there, Adam. Number one, they've only got one date. Number two, they moved it out of the fall, so it wasn't face of the sun hot like it had been the last couple of years.
And in the fall, let's face it, football's a pretty big deal in Texas, and hunting season and all the things that you fight in the fall. And there's no question, when you do one date, you enhance your chances for success with the crowd. And in addition to Sunday, I thought the Friday and Saturday crowds were pretty good. And if traffic's any measure, then they did really well, because it was, I won't say it was back to the old days at Texas, but there was a lot of traffic leaving there both Friday and Saturday, which is an indicator that the crowd was solid and we were a little bit back to the old school Texas, which was awesome. The one thing I would say about this configuration that I love is that forever we talked about these 1.5 miles and we referred to them as the cookie cutters. Texas is anything but a cookie cutter, not just in its layout, but the way it races, the way you have to prepare, and the challenges that it creates for some of the best drivers. And these weren't a bunch of has-beens that were out there spinning out. They were the best drivers that have an unbelievable resume when you look at the history of Texas. And I also think that when you partner that with the changes at Atlanta, another 1.5 miles that now has a totally unique approach, we have really changed the dynamic of these intermediates, which has infused some excitement and some challenge and created a wild card element, if you will, at a 1.5 mile racetrack, which is awesome for all involved.
I heard somebody saying this week, Zach, that it's interesting with Texas right now, especially in turns 1 and 2, the way it's configured. Yeah, it's a one-groove racetrack for the most part, down low, which at least when they spin gives them more room to spin and gather it back in again, so they're not smacking the wall and tearing things up.
That's absolutely true. And I feel like, yes, to a large extent, that is a single groove racetrack right around that white line. But you see kind of early in that race, some guys kind of just treading their way up there just to test what that outer edge is. And as that race goes on, it gets a little bit farther wider, a little bit farther toward the outside lane, and opens up at least another opportunity to make a pass. We saw that really work out in the Xfinity race on Saturday. Sunday, we saw that a little bit more, especially as we got through stage 2 toward the later stages of those races. And really, we saw how treacherous it was. As much as turn 1 and 2 get talked about through the reconfiguration, we saw those bumps in turns 3 and 4 really play a huge factor on those late restarts as well.
I know, Adam, you had Joey Logano in the booth with you on Saturday, and he's talked about it since then. He just wishes that the old PJ1 they put down, until it gets itself it's worn into the track now, but until it completely gets out of the track, that it's going to continue to be a big challenge.
And everyone talked about that dividing line, and Zach mentioned that too. And that, to me, is just a tremendous added element to how you attack it. And we saw, as Zach referred to, drivers getting more and more aggressive later in the race. And I just go right to Denny Hamlin. And you look at the move that he made. Does he make that move? Is he that aggressive on the outside of Chase Elliott on that restart if he hasn't won and he's locked into the playoffs? At some point, do you just take your medicine a little bit in the outside lane? Denny didn't do that. He went after it and unfortunately got away from him and he hit the wall, and he's got the wins to fall back on. But the level of aggression and how far those drivers were willing to take it is what made that a great race. And that's why we were entertained, and that's what has now made Texas a special place to go and compete.